We'll get started in just a minute here, folks. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Walk Cares Fund team and our guest panel for a webinar on caregiving in rural communities. I am your host, Kristen Mackey. I'm the Community Relations and Outreach Program Manager for Walk Cares. And I'd like to go around to our panel now and have each person just briefly introduce themselves. So Kelly, let's start with you.
Good morning. My name is Kelly Shaw, and I am the Rural Health Workforce Director at the Department of Health. And we do programs and services designed to support the healthcare systems in rural communities in Washington.
Fantastic. And Lynn.
Hello, I'm Lynn Kimball. I'm Executive Director for Aging and Long-Term Care of Eastern Washington. We're the area agency on aging that serves Ferry, Stevens, Pend Oreille, Spokane, and Whitman counties in Eastern Washington.
Thank you. And Danny.
Hi, I'm Danny Race, she, her pronouns. I've been a caregiver professionally for 15 years and have been an unpaid family provider for much longer for my brother and sister who are both disabled.
Okay. And Julie.
Julie Gardner, I'm the Long-Term Care Workforce Navigator for DSHS. I work in Eastern Washington, covering the Central to Eastern Washington portion of the state.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to have all of you here today to talk about this really important topic. We are going to start off with some remarks from our panel, and then we will share a brief overview of the Walk Cares Fund. And finally, we will have an opportunity at the end for audience Q&A. You are welcome to go ahead and start entering your questions using the Q&A button as they come up for our panel to answer later in the webinar. And the slides and recording of the webinar will be available on our website at walkcaresfund.wa.gov/webinars later today. And before we get started, I just want to define what we're talking about when we say long-term care or caregiving. Long-term care is help with activities of daily living like bathing, eating, dressing, preparing meals, grocery shopping, and more. It does not include medical care like doctor's visits and treatment for medical conditions. Long-term care covers a broad range of needs and circumstances, including for younger people who have been unexpectedly injured or become disabled or ill. And a lot of people don't realize how many different services and supports are included when we talk about long-term care. We often think of it as care in a residential setting like a nursing home or assisted living, but it also can include care provided in your own home. And in fact, most people with long-term care needs can stay in their own homes with the right support. It's also very common for family caregivers to not realize that they are a caregiver. You might go to your mom's house a couple times a week to cook meals, drive her to appointments, and make sure she's taken her meds, which are all common care activities. The majority of this type of care is actually provided on an informal basis as unpaid care from a family member, a friend, or a neighbor. And we're going to go ahead before we get started and launch a quick opening poll. If folks can go ahead and answer that, that would help us learn a little bit more about who we've got in the audience today. So I'll give folks just a minute to fill that out. Still got answers coming in, so I'm just giving it a couple more seconds. Okay. So Thank you so much for answering that. It looks like we do have quite a few people here who work in long-term care or related fields, as well as almost half of our audience has provided unpaid care to a family member or loved one. You can see that caregiving really is a very common experience. And then we've got some folks who are less familiar with long-term care. And lots of folks who are either only somewhat familiar or not very familiar with our topic today. So hopefully this should give you a good overview. And same for the Walk Here's Fund. So thank you so much for filling that out. I really appreciate it. And with that, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Kelly to get started. Oh, Kelly, you're on mute.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, my name is Kelly Shaw. I am the Rural Health Workforce Director at the Department of Health in the Office of Rural Health. We do a lot of work with rural communities to support their local health systems. I just wanted to start the discussion off this morning by talking about the disparities in rural health care. Probably a lot of you already know this, but people in rural communities die at higher rates than those in urban areas. And you can see that over time, that disparity between rural and urban here is stays pretty constant over time. So there's been highs and lows, but they tend to dip accordingly with urban communities as well. Next slide, please. If we look at age-adjusted death rates per 100,000 people based on the 10 leading causes of death in Washington, this is, again, just a graph to show the disparities between what we're experiencing in rural and urban communities. Most of the leading causes of death are chronic diseases, and you can see very significant differences in the rates of cancers, heart disease, accidents, chronic respiratory diseases, diabetes, et cetera, between rural and urban communities. And there's a whole host of reasons why these disparities exist. I'm going to highlight just a couple for you on the next slide, please. So why do these rural health disparities exist? And these are just a few facts that I pulled out. Adults who receive yearly dental care are lower. The rates of adults who receive yearly dental care are lower in rural communities than they are in the urban counterparts. There's lower rates of adults with insurance coverage. And we all know how difficult insurance coverage is for people needing long-term care. So that's a significant factor in rural communities. We also have a decrease in adults that have a primary care provider or a personal care provider that oversees their care in rural communities. There are some behavioral differences, which are people in rural communities receive less cancer screening tests. Both colorectal and breast cancer screening rates are lower in rural communities. The rate of adults who are obese is higher in rural communities than it is in urban areas. Again, the percentage of people who smoke is higher in rural communities. Women who smoke during pregnancy is also higher. So you can see a lot of what we call kind of risky behaviors for chronic diseases are higher in rural communities than in urban communities. Children who are hospitalized for unintentional injuries is higher in rural communities, and adult with unmet medical needs due to cost. And what I wanted to kind of share with is the fact that rural communities experience less access to care than urban counterparts. And that might make sense to most of you. And there's many reasons for that. One is just the travel distance it takes to get to facilities when you're living in rural communities. So the distance to the closest hospital, the distance to any kind of medical specialties, or even OB care in rural communities is really diminished. And then you have just that geographic isolation is prominent in rural communities. And there's other reasons for that as well. We see really financial instability or fragility of rural healthcare systems. We've seen rural hospitals close across the country. We've seen rural OB, access to OB services in rural communities have closed across the country. And certainly in our state, we've seen one rural hospital close their OB services. So we are at a tremendous disadvantage in rural communities for all of these reasons put together. We also see decreased healthcare workforce in rural communities. So we don't have the number of providers to care for the older and sicker population that we see in rural communities. So there's an increased need for healthcare services, and yet less people available to provide those services. So I just want to set that framework for the rest of the discussions today, and will be available to answer any questions later.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And next we are going to go to Lynn.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. So I'm here is representing an area agency on aging. And what we do in Washington State is we are a network of community-based providers that are really tasked with how do we help plan for and help provide for the needs of older adults, people with disabilities, and caregivers across the state. And our focus is really around how do you help get people the services they need to stay at home and stay in their communities as long and as safely as possible. So as you can imagine, when you talk about long-term care, we definitely have some experience, and we have a little bit of a role that we play in local communities, and especially in rural communities. So as an area agency on aging that serves 5 counties in Eastern Washington, that is everything from farmland and the Palouse all the way up to going past mountain ranges to reach one of our communities, Republic and Ferry County. We've got some obviously geographic barriers, and physical access is an issue, as you just heard. Depending on the time of year, it can be very difficult to get services to someone, depending on what's going on, if it's snowing, if it's raining, what kind of disasters we're seeing at the moment with fires and other emergencies. But really, when we look at all long-term care services, and especially services to keep people at home, access is a really key theme. So one of the areas we hear most often when we go visit rural communities and we talk with them around what are the biggest challenges and barriers you see is transportation. So if you do not have transportation, you lose access to other services that you really need, transportation to your medical appointments, to providers that you might have to travel long ways to reach because there's very limited healthcare providers in many of our rural communities. The other piece we see a lot is access to caregivers is another big barrier. Some of the rural communities we serve have a very diverse age range. So one of the communities that we serve, Ponderay County, about 40% of the population right now is over the age of 60. And so as you can imagine, as time goes on, the less working age individuals you have to provide care, the harder it is to find and recruit caregivers for when you need that kind of support to stay at home. So you see a lot of reliance on family members. You see a lot of local communities really trying to resource, this is a wonderful person. This person kind of helps support this block, this area, and really that reliance on neighbors and one another to try to get your needs met. We mentioned access to healthcare, and healthcare is definitely a part of an individual's health and well-being. But another key issue is access to healthy and affordable food. So along with transportation to be able to get to the grocery store, once you get to the grocery store, the high cost we see in rural areas of how much it costs to get fresh produce, to get fresh food, being able to get access to food during certain times of year when it's hard to get by and get around. We also see similar issues that we see across the entire state as well around access to affordable housing. There's limited housing stock in many of the communities we serve. So as housing stock deteriorates over time and less properties are being developed, and there really isn't a lot of development that is targeted to being affordable. So older adults and caregivers that are reliant on renting, access to affordable housing becomes an issue as well. In addition, one of the areas we often gets overlooked as well in rural communities is access to broadband and internet and cell service. Many of the communities we serve may not have access to broadband, may have limited or spotty cell phone service. So as you can imagine, if you have providers that are reliant on telehealth or other ways to try to access them, it's hard to access if you don't have those kind of services available in your community. So these are a lot of barriers. We definitely recognize there are some unique challenges for rural communities in getting access to care and access to caregiving and access to supports. So that's where local communities get really creative, working with local providers, working together to try to create solutions so that we can serve people and help people stay at home and stay in their community of choice as long as possible. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it back to Kristen.
Thank you, Lynn. And now we will go to Danny.
Hi. So I'm going to be echoing a lot of what you heard, but it's from my personal experience as a caregiver and also as somebody who has needed care in a rural community. So I'm from Asotin, Washington, which is an extremely rural area of Washington. And like most places, rural communities obviously find that people prefer to receive their care in their own home. More and more I'm hearing of people that want to stay home, and but it can really present a lot of challenges to remain in your home, and also when that's a rural place. Most notably, as populations age, the younger individuals tend to move to larger cities, and so there ends up being that there are less people of working age to provide care. On the flip side of that, there also tends to be a lack of knowledge of caregiving as a professional career. There are actually a lot of people who are providing unpaid caregiving for family or others that don't realize that they can get paid for this work still. And so it's been a really interesting situation. A lot of the times I find somebody who can actually get paid through Medicaid but isn't even aware. Additionally, rural communities are farther away from larger towns. And so when you have that lack of a workforce locally, that means you're dependent on a larger area or a larger town to send workers or caregivers your direction. When I first started as a caregiver, I was located in Royal City, Washington, which is around 32 miles from Moses Lake. So when somebody locally in Royal City came to me and said, "Hey, I need a caregiver. How do I find someone?" I was the only caregiver at the time. And if I was topped with hours, I had to recommend that they go to the AAA or the local area on aging, or one of the agencies in Moses Lake that would send a professional caregiver out to us. This became a problem because there's not enough incentives to get caregivers to drive their own car from Moses Lake, 32 miles, to the individual that needs long-term care's home, and then provide care, then to drive their own car back 32 miles back to their own home. The problem is that the cost of gas and the cost of their own car's wear and tear, the cost of having insurance, all of that isn't covered like as a professional caregiver. That's all on your own dime. So there is a real problem in trying to get individuals from larger communities to come to rural communities to provide care. At the same time, there's a lack of community transport from larger towns to smaller towns. So we don't have the, "Oh, well, that's okay. The caregiver can just ride the bus." Now, there is a Grant County Transport Authority, but they only come once a day, and then they go back. And they come back late in the evening, and that might not be the exact care hours that the consumer needs. So a lot of the times those transportation opportunities don't work in rural communities. Additionally, one of the things that I run into all the time as a local caregiver is just a simple lack of community resources in general. In larger towns, you often have either agencies, nonprofits, or like you have a local AAA area on agencies that's right there ready to provide you with information if you just go down to 6 blocks this direction. Well, in rural communities, you either have to drive to those resources or get there somehow, get in touch with them. And so there tends to be a lack of information in rural communities about what to do when you enter a situation where a loved one needs care, and just because it's not readily available. Because of all of these things, a couple things have tended to happen that I've noticed as a caregiver. So a lot of family and friends tend to be relied on more heavily in rural situations, because honestly, in certain situations where a loved one immediately needs care, like for instance, 5 years ago, I had a spinal cord injury. My family scrambled trying to figure out what we're going to do. And the reason was because I was the local caregiver. I was the one local caregiver. Which meant suddenly the one local caregiver wasn't able to provide care for herself, or my brother and sister at the time, who are usually my clients. And so my mom ended up becoming my unpaid caregiver for quite some time. And she was unpaid because after my spinal cord injury, my health insurance paid for several things. One of the things that they paid for was nursing staff to come to my home. They paid for physical therapy, occupational therapy, but they don't pay for transportation to medical services. And when you live rurally, sometimes that's a long distance. My specialists were 65 miles away in one direction. My mom had to take me to those specialists about 2 times a week at the beginning, because the specialists are who takes care of you after a extremely specialized disabling event like a spinal cord injury, a traumatic brain injury, And so we didn't have a choice. We had to travel that far, and I didn't have the funds to pay my mom out of pocket. So we just did it because we had to survive. And that is the situation that I find a lot of families in rural communities. Either they don't qualify for Medicaid or disability for because say they didn't plan for long-term care. They didn't spend down their assets to be able to qualify for Medicare within the amount of time that they needed to. And now they've just got hit with the reality that they don't qualify. And so families just struggle to make it work because we don't have a choice. And a lot of the times, the only people you can get to really work that hard for you is a family member or a best friend or a neighbor, because it's a big ask. You know, a lot of the times a family member has to take time off of their own work, their own job, in order to help care for you. And those are asks that you can only do from somebody who really loves you and is close to you. So that is the type of care that I see very often happening in rural communities, whether paid or unpaid. Additionally, the other aspect that I have found very interesting about rural communities is that as the local caregiver of Royal City, when I was there I lived there for about 10 plus years, your name and information, once the community finds out that you are a caregiver, it gets passed around from family to family to family through this grapevine of information, through the community, churches, through schools. And they may not even know you, but somebody who they know, who knows them, who knows their neighbor, knows that you're a caregiver. And so they're coming to you directly for information because of that lack of education on where do you go when your family needs care for the first time? What do you do if you don't qualify for Medicaid? Is there a way to pay out of pocket, and what does that look like? All of those are questions that local rural caregivers get asked constantly. And then it's also I just found out I'm having an infant with Down syndrome. Who do I talk to? And so we're constantly sending them out to these resources that are usually in larger cities to help answer their questions. But you really become a community resource yourself as a caregiver. And it's something that caregivers that are already in communities that have all these resources don't find. Usually those caregivers can just say, oh, walk down the street, it's fine. Rural caregivers, it's different. You end up being their lifeline to how their loved one is going to survive this and how the family is going to make it through this. Obviously, ultimately, the lack of resources impact those needing the long-term care the most. Directly after my spinal cord injury, I could not drive for a while. We were in the process of purchasing my grandparents' house during that time, which is located in Asotin. Asotin, where our house is now, is 14 miles out of the town of Asotin, technically. Now, there's this dial-a-ride system I could use, but I was told that basically if you don't schedule them 24 hours in advance or know of when your ride's going to be, just don't count on them. They're not going to be able to come get you. So in my mind, my thoughts was, okay, what if there's an emergency? What if, does that mean that only an ambulance is available? What if it's only a small emergency? I can't pay out of pocket for an ambulance. And so those things were huge questions at the start of my spinal cord injury, because I needed to balance what's going to be best financially for my family. And thank God, about 3 years after my spinal cord injury, I was able to drive again. but situations like that can really dramatically impact the quality that somebody with a disability in a rural community, the quality of life. And that was terrifying for me as a mom of 2 boys. That the answer I received was, well, I hope you know your neighbors. And again, it's that those are the people you rely on in a rural community. So those are just some of my observations, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny, for sharing that. Next, we're going to go to Julie.
My name is Julie Gardner. Again, I work for DSHS, and back recently, as we all know, caregivers are very hard to find and get them through the caregiving process, because there's several processes. If they want to work for an agency, if they want to work for Consumer Direct or whatever, there's many hiccups in the process to become a caregiver. So DSHS has hired navigators throughout Washington State to help people through the process. So basically my job is tasked to recruit caregivers and help them through, hold their hand from saying they want to become a caregiver to finding an employer and getting them employed. And so I work in Central and Eastern Washington, Ellensburg East, North and South. And so I have a lot of area to cover, a lot of very rural communities. The concerns that I have in rural communities is I'm having trouble, obviously, with technology. Some people don't have internet access at their homes. Some people don't have cell phones or cell phones that work in their homes. I'm working to try to get people hooked up with the government phones if they qualify, so they have cell phone service, but caregivers have to call in their hours. Caregivers have to sign up to be a caregiver online. And so if they don't have access to technology in their homes, I've got to try to figure out how to get them that access, whether getting them to the work source, getting them to a library, getting them somewhere where they can use the technology to fill out the forms needed to become a caregiver. And that's challenging. I have a particular person in Bridgeport. It's 45 minutes to the work source. I've had to send him there 3 times, one way, 45 minutes to complete his paperwork. In addition to technology concerns, access to phone and computers, we have community resources with language. Some people are not native English speakers, and getting them the information. I have an interpreter service I could use with them over the phone, but in many instances, they don't have the use of an interpreter service. They could use Google Translate on their technology if they have the technology available to them in these locations. So language access is very difficult in these rural communities. You know, just getting somebody to be able to communicate with them in their native tongue to be able to work with clients. Another concern we have is, so I'm recruiting caregivers, but if there's no work source in the area, if there's no DSHS in the area, I've got to figure out how I can get into that community and get to the people who don't know about caregiving. Maybe they're already, as Daniel said, maybe they're already caregiving for a family member and not getting paid. Or maybe they've always thought about caregiving, but they don't know how to get started. So I need to be able to find those people and get them through the process to become caregivers. I've started reaching out to the work sources. I'm looking for job fairs. I'm actually looking into getting some flyers in libraries, even small schools, maybe possibly. I've thought about seeing if I can send flyers home with people, with the kids, to see if parents are interested in becoming caregivers. So just, it's been a challenge just to figure out how to get into some of these communities and find people willing to be caregivers and get them through the process. Another big issue we have is our caregiving population is aging. People are working full-time hours and are aging and can't be doing that much caregiving anymore, but there are no caregivers to take over for them. Because the process has been difficult. It still is difficult to get through the process to become a caregiver. So our caregivers are overworked. They become a known caregiver and people are calling them and saying, can you work for me? I can't find anybody else. So we need to really change that and be able to get more caregivers in the workforce. But at the same time, there aren't many agencies in some of the rural areas, and the agencies thankfully take care of the caregivers they have, but they're not often taking new referrals. They're not taking new clients from the social workers because they want to keep the caregivers that they do have full time if that's what they want. So they're not accepting new clients. So it's kind of a weird thing is we have a caregiver who may want to work, but they can't work for an agency because the agency doesn't have new clients, but there are clients out there that need caregivers. So we just have this weird conundrum of people who want to become caregivers, but the agencies don't have the clients because the social workers aren't sending them to the agencies. So I'm just kind of working on bridging those gaps, which has been difficult in rural counties. Rural communities is figuring out, I've just recently started just running reports and figuring out who's out there that don't have caregivers yet and what can I do to get into that community and find a couple of caregivers to meet these needs. So another is transportation. You know, I have people who say, I want to be a caregiver, but I don't have transportation. And there isn't transportation to the client's house. They might be able to get a mainline transportation, but then they have another 3 miles to walk to the client's house from the bus, and it's just not feasible. So getting people to the employers' homes where they can provide care is difficult as well. So, you know, there's lots of difficulties I'm coming across and just working really hard to try to minimize these barriers and figure out how we can get people technology, how we can get people access. You know, it's I'm willing to come out and help people fill out their paperwork, but if it's a 3-hour drive for, you know, 20 minutes of paperwork, how best can we do this a little bit better? What resources can I utilize? So as I said, I've only been in this position since July, and I'm really working at expanding the resources I have to be able to meet the needs of the clients in each of these situations, or the caregivers in each of these situations, in order to serve the clients. So, you know, rural caregiving is tough, and finding rural caregivers is tough. And there's lots of barriers, but we're just doing our best to try to get into these rural communities and try to find ways to get in. Recently had a social worker call me and say, I need a caregiver in Grand Coulee. I don't have any caregivers in Grand Coulee. There's one agency, maybe 2 agencies in Grand Coulee. They don't have any caregivers. So we have nobody there. So I need to figure out how to get into Grand Coulee and figure out who would be interested in finding a caregiver. The opposite side of that is like I recently went to a job fair in Othello. I had 25 people interested in becoming caregivers. I have 3 clients in Othello. So it's hard because I do in some areas have a lot of interest, but the clients aren't there right now. Not to say that there wouldn't be clients that people have given up and maybe family members have taken over because there's no caregivers. So it's just a matter of really getting into each of these small communities, figuring out what resources we need to develop in order to get more caregivers in there and doing the work to get more caregivers. So I'm happy to be here and talk about these issues and see if we can come up with plans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. And next, we are going to give a quick overview of the WA Cares Fund. So WA Cares, for those who aren't familiar, is a universal long-term care program in Washington State. It's an earned benefit, which means you contribute for a certain number of years in order to qualify for benefits. It's entirely self-funded from worker contributions, which go into a dedicated trust fund that is only used for this program. Most workers in the state contribute to WA Cares and contribute 0.58% of each paycheck. You can see on your screen here what this looks like for the typical worker who makes just over $50,000 a year and would contribute $291 each year, or about $24 per month. You only contribute to WA Cares while you're working. Contributions stop if you retire or if you become unemployed. And everyone is covered at the same rate, regardless of pre-existing conditions. When it comes time to claim your benefits, there are no copays or deductibles, and you don't need to file claims and pay upfront for services. Instead, we connect you with contracted providers who offer the services that you want and pay those providers directly. Contributions to the program began in July of 2023, and benefits will become available in July 2026. This is what those contributions can look like over the course of a career. You can see that the typical worker's income is just about at the level in green here in the middle, and that $290 in contributions each year totals out at $8,700 over 30 years. Almost all Washington workers contribute to WA Cares, and to determine whether someone counts as a Washington worker, we look at whether their work is localized in Washington. So that can be complicated, but because we use the same definition as the state's paid family and medical leave program, that gives us an easy rule to work from, which is that workers who are included in paid leave will also be included in WA Cares unless they have an approved WA Cares exemption from the Employment Security Department. If you're not sure whether you participate in paid leave and WA Cares, you can check your pay stub or ask your employer for more information. If your work is not localized in Washington, you are automatically not included in paid leave or WA Cares and don't need to file for a WA Cares exemption. Federal employees are also automatically not included. Employees of tribes are only included if the tribe has opted in, and self-employed people are also only included if they have opted in. There are some other groups of workers who can get an exemption from the program, which they must apply to the Employment Security Department to get. So the first kind of group of exemptions is workers who can apply for an optional exemption based on meeting and continuing to meet certain conditions. So this includes workers who live out of state but work in Washington, temporary workers with non-immigrant visas, and spouses or registered domestic partners of active duty military members. These three exemptions were all created for groups of workers who would be unlikely to qualify for or be able to use their benefits. They're available on an ongoing basis and they are conditional, so you must continue to meet those exemption criteria to maintain the exemption. There are also two types of permanent exemptions. One is for veterans with a 70% or higher service-connected disability rating. This is a group of folks who have access to some nursing home care through the VA, and they can choose to apply for a permanent exemption. Those exemptions are available on an ongoing basis. There was also an exemption available in the past for workers who had private long-term care insurance before November 2021. These applications are no longer available, but under current law, any workers who already have an approved private insurance exemption will continue to be exempt from the program permanently. And if you are interested in any more details on exemptions and how to apply, you can visit wacaresfund.wa.gov/exemptions. If you are self-employed, you can choose to opt into the WA Cares Fund and protect yourself with the same affordable benefits that are available to other Washington workers. Like other workers, you would contribute 0.58% of your earnings, which includes your net earnings and any gross wages that are paid to you from your business entity. To earn benefits, you must work at least 500 hours per year. And for self-employed people who elect coverage, this is calculated by dividing your gross annual wages by the current minimum wage. Applications to opt in became available in July of last year. And if you're interested, you can learn more on our website at wacaresfund.wa.gov/opt-in. Everyone who is contributing to WA Cares more than 500 hours per year is earning benefits, part-time and temporary workers included. And by contributing for a certain number of years, you earn access to the benefit. There are 3 different pathways that you can use to meet the contribution requirements. The first is early access. So this is for workers who haven't yet been able to earn lifetime access, but have a care need while working or soon after leaving work. And to qualify for this pathway, you need to have contributed for at least 3 of the last 6 years at the time you apply for benefits. The next pathway is lifetime access, and this is the pathway that we expect the majority of Washington workers will use to qualify for benefits. So to use this pathway, workers must contribute for 10 years without a break of 5 or more consecutive years. And finally, we have a special pathway that is just for people who are near retirement. So if you were born before 1968 and are therefore near retirement as the program begins and unlikely to qualify for the 10 years pathway, you can still earn 10% of the full benefit amount for each year that you work. So for example, if you work and contribute 500 hours or more per year for 3 years, you would earn 30% of the benefit amount, or just under $11,000, which is adjusted for inflation. Near retirees will have permanent access to whatever percentage of the benefit amount they earn at any time that they need care. And they are also able to qualify through one of the other pathways if they meet those requirements. Let's talk about benefits. Once workers meet contribution requirements and need help with at least 3 activities of daily living, they can get access to the benefit, which the full benefit amount is $36,500, which is used really as a budget for services and supports. And that benefit amount will increase over time with inflation. With WA Cares, workers get the flexibility and freedom to choose the services and supports that meet their needs and their family's needs. So for some people, that will mean in-home care or care in a residential facility like a nursing home, but it could also include things like home modifications to make your home safer, and assistive technology for things like medication reminders and fall detection that can help with some care needs. WA Cares is really designed to help people age in place in their own homes as long as possible. That's what almost all of us want to do, and most of us can as long as we're able to get those supports in place. WA Cares also has many options to provide support for family caregivers who are caring for someone right now on an unpaid basis. So you can choose someone who would otherwise be caring for you and be unpaid to get training and be paid, even your spouse. And WA Cares can also help lessen the impact on family caregivers by making sure they can get other support services. Under current law, you must be a resident of Washington State in order to use benefits. However, the LTSS Trust Commission, which is the body that oversees WA Cares, has recommended to the Washington State Legislature that benefits be made portable for people who contribute to the program, but leave the state before they need care. The legislature would need to take action to make that change, but that is something that is under consideration. We get asked a lot about how far that benefit amount will go. And while it won't cover 100% of care that everyone needs, it would cover the amount of in-home care that the average Medicaid client uses right now for roughly a year. About a third of people need care for a year or less. And for those people, WA Cares may be able to cover all the care that they need, depending on what types of services they choose to use. For other families, WA Cares will provide immediate relief and time to plan for future care costs. So these are some examples of how someone might use your benefit. You could pay a family member to care for you for about 10 hours a week for 2 years and get care supplies for a total of about $33,500. Or you could choose services to help you stay safely in your own home. So you could purchase $15,000 worth of renovations like bathroom modifications or a wheelchair ramp to improve your home's accessibility. get an electric wheelchair or scooter, and have meals delivered for 3 years for around $26,800. Or someone who needs long-term care due to an unexpected injury could get 20 hours of in-home care per week for about a year, plus transportation to appointments and crutches for about $34,600. And finally, I want to just highlight, as we work to implement the program, that the Walk Here Spend team is already planning how best to serve beneficiaries who live in rural areas. So these are just a few of the things that we have underway to ensure that we do have enough providers to offer services to all Walk Here's beneficiaries. We have a team that's dedicated to registering and supporting providers. And in addition to participating in state level efforts to address the workforce shortage, including efforts to increase providers in rural areas, this team is planning for other ways to increase providers in areas where they're most needed. Some of these plans are as simple as making it easy for providers to register so that more of them are able and willing to go through the process. And we are also looking at policy solutions to help address this problem. So for example, as part of our work with the LTSS Trust Commission to set maximum rates for providers, we are researching ways to incentivize providers to serve people in rural areas. Walk Cares also offers a variety of ways to use your benefit, like we just talked about, and many of those ways don't depend on the availability of professional caregivers. So being able to make a family member a paid caregiver helps us tap into an additional source of care and offers more options for beneficiaries who want to receive care from a loved one. And some beneficiaries will also use their benefit for other things like home safety modifications or assistive technology. And with that, we are going to go ahead and move into Q&A. I do want to note that we're not going to be able to speak to any specifics of initiatives or proposed legislation today. If any bills related to Walk Cares are signed into law this session, we will post updates on the website and send a notification to our mailing list, which you can find at the URL on your screen here. We're also not going to be able to answer any detailed employer reporting questions. Those are best directed to the Employment Security Department using the contact information on your screen. And I'm going to go ahead and see what we've got in the Q&A. So our first question is from someone asking, how much is a friend or neighbor paid when they provide care, and how are they screened? Can a family member provide care and receive pay? So there's kind of two different answers here. Sometimes family members can be paid through Medicaid right now, and then in the future, folks will be able to pay a loved one as a paid caregiver through Walk Cares if they qualify for Walk Cares benefits. Lynn or Julie, would one of you be able to address that question for Medicaid?
You want to take this one, Julie?
Sure. So somebody can become a caregiver through Medicaid by filling out a background check and application, depending on the employer. I'm assuming if it's a friend or family member, then they want to go through Consumer Direct of Washington. So they would fill out a background check and application. Background check comes back. They would also be responsible to do a couple I-9 different hiring paperwork, a 5-hour orientation, and then they can start working immediately. They have 120 days from the date they start working to complete their home care aid training. Again, depending on if they are considered a family member, they would have a 30-hour training commitment. If they're non-family member, they would have a 70-hour training commitment. And then they would have to take a test afterwards, their home care aid skills and test. Pay, I believe, is a little over $20 an hour. I can't remember the, I want to say $20.50, maybe $20.50 for the Consumer Direct starting pay. Once they become certified as a home care aid, they do get a bump. And then after every 2,000 hours that they work, they also get a bump. So the only thing that they have to be over 18 to be a caregiver, and you can't provide care for a spouse. And so that's the only requirements we have. You can provide care for your parents, you can provide care for your children as long as your children are over 18. And any other family member, but you can't provide care for a spouse. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, Julie. And looks like we've had a couple folks try raising their hands. We're going to go ahead and ask that if you can type your question into the Q&A function, we'll go ahead and answer those questions for you. There should be a Q&A button on your screen where you can submit those. Our next question is from someone wondering if folks who opted out of Walk Cares because they bought a private long-term care plan are monitored, that they keep the plan. Do they have to provide any proof that they have maintained that policy? And under current law, no. Private insurance exemptions are permanent, and there is no requirement for ongoing verification. That is something that the LTSS Trust Commission has recommended to the legislature, but the legislature would have to take action on that to make that change. So no, under current law, there is no monitoring of that. And then our final question, we've got someone asking about being in the process of obtaining the final state license for a home care agency, and asking about how they can help bring caregiver solutions to rural communities. I don't know, Julie, if you want to address that.
So there are 3 navigators throughout Washington State, as I said. Myself in Eastern Washington, we have one in the Seattle, King County, Whatcom area, and then one in Tacoma, Vancouver, up to Port Angeles area. So reaching out to one of the navigators to give us whatever thoughts that you might have on this would be fantastic. We also have a long-term care workforce group that meets, I can't remember how often we meet, but we do meet, and we have breakout sessions to talk about some of these challenges. If you want, you can send me an email and I can get you in touch with the person in Seattle, and they would love to talk with you about this and come up with any solutions you may have and brainstorm. So my email is Julie, Julie Gardner, GARDNER at dshs.wa.gov.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That is the end of the questions that we have submitted, and we are drawing close to the end of our time here. I am going to share my screen one more time to share some contact information and links that might be helpful for folks. We will, as I said earlier, be posting both the recording and the slides from this webinar on our website at wcaresfund.wa.gov/webinars. So you can check back there if you want to access those resources. You can also reach out if you come up with additional questions later to WaCares. You can contact us by email using the email form on our website that will route you to the appropriate agency to address your questions, or you can contact us at one of the phone numbers below if you have questions depending on what topic your questions are about. And that is all we have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you again to our panel for making time to share your expertise and your experience. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.